Little girls should be seen and not heard. Oh, bondage! On the earth! 1, 2, 3, 4!
As the 1970s progressed, three social movements, women's liberation, queer liberation, and punk, seemingly only tangentially related, began to capture the collective consciousness across North America. Each offered a variation of subverting gender expression and expectations. As punk bounced from New York City to Los Angeles, then to London and back, it became apparent that many of the progenitors of the genre were either female, queer, or both. The term punk itself was taxonomically the appropriation of prison slang for the usually younger passive partner in anal intercourse, the byproduct of situational homosexuality. By the late 1970s, the visual language of punk was more identifiable than the musical genre itself, which had the sonic capacity to include early electronic synth band Suicide, as well as the likes of punk disco of Blondie, the world music of the Talking Heads, the guitar noise of Television, and the sexual angst of the Buzzcocks. In the eyes of the public, however, punk was quickly becoming a uniform of sorts. To bastardize Simone de Beauvoir, one is not born, but rather becomes a punk. The visual aesthetic of punk was largely lifted wholesale from the works of avant-garde fashion designer and early punk Vivienne Westwood and her then partner, the huckster showman Svengali, Malcolm McLaren. The look was codified in 1978 in Derek Jarman's film, Jubilee, and in the pages of every major publication. Early punk was performative, middle-class kids adopting the torn and safety pin t-shirts, studded leather jackets, and Doc Martens and mohawks as authentic persona of their youth revolution. This was both a sincere indoctrination and a superficial performance of aesthetics, cutting up and safety pinning back one's wardrobe together as sort of Frankenstein dress code became a signifier of punk, when in actuality it was the aestheticization and commodification of poverty and the fetishization of visual signifiers of the lower class ranking as a credibility of authenticity. Punk's confrontational aesthetics, the bondage gear, ripped clothing, aggressive makeup, and dyed hair, were the anti-fashion statement that would soon be commodified, caricatured, and broadcast far and wide as media absorbed the aesthetics and rolled out a new archetypal stock character, the punk, that would soon become an iconic yet dated reference point. While perhaps this codification by outside observation would define the concept of punk in anthropological terms, it had a side effect of transmitting the conceptual aesthetics of punk to the masses. This allowed the suburban consumer the ability to embrace the ideology of punk as an attainable option, just another performative cliche such as the jock, the nerd, the debutante, the weirdo. It was meant to be parodied in a cartoonish manner, striking a blow against urban lawlessness. But a subsection of the audience, however, found these images repackaged and refracted through the outside voice, this false authorship, to be authentic and indeed aspirational.
Heterosexuality is the opiate of the masses!
By the mid-1980s, the punk scene had been taken over by the rise of hardcore, the aggressive, hyper-masculine-centered form of music and performance, and the marginalized voices of women and queer and trans artists who had once thrived in the experimental fringes and served as the foundation of punk had found themselves increasingly unwelcome. Mainstream punk, itself an oxymoron, was taking the caricatured toxic masculinity and misogyny of the broader heterodominant culture to heart. Queer punks found themselves saddled with a dual dissatisfaction from both within the punk scene and within the 80s assimilationist and hardly inclusive gay and lesbian community. It was in this isolating dislocation that G.B. Jones and Bruce LaBruce would launch HOMOCORE, later redubbed QUEERCORE. It is perhaps the last great social multimedia movement that the queer community has intrinsically been linked to on a broad spectrum. It spanned zines, music, theater, filmmaking, dance, political action, performance, and more. At its core, it was the form of community building and engagement where no community existed. Jones and LaBruce simply lied and spun tales of a queer utopia. Queercore was, in many ways, just as wildly performative as traditional punk, with its own set of signifiers and language. Jones would help create the humorous, sexy, irreverent aesthetics of queercore, borrowing from the over-exaggerated persona of the Warhol superstars and the situationists. The Situationists, the Society of the Spectacle, Revolution of the Everyday, those were all heavy influences. We were creating a spectacle, LaBruce would say. By the spread of the fallacy of a large queer punk scene within Toronto, fans of JD's and HOMOCORE, a zine, began to look around in both Toronto and across Canada and the US and wonder, where is my scene? Spontaneously, it seemed, various queer punk bands suddenly began to form seemingly at random. Queercore, by its nature, was a provocation. It sought to expand the limitations of the perceptions of punk to be more inclusive of feminism and queerness. I call this phenomenon subcultural mitosis, in which a small cell of like-minded individuals suddenly split, creating two or more identical cells. In the case of queercore, as queer punk bands sprang into being, the non-existent scene suddenly formed itself, and that was supported by the proliferation of other, more like-minded individuals and bands. Suddenly, this communitas is formed, largely by chance, but also by a rebellion to the exclusionary and controlling behavior of assimilationist factions of the gay community. In Olympia, Washington, another revolution was brewing that would implement the subcultural mitosis principle to even greater effect. RIOT GRRRL would combine the focus of third-wave feminism with the abrasiveness of rudimentary punk. Much like queercore, RIOT GRRRL also worked to push the not only sonic boundaries of punk, but also the overall culture of performance itself to make enough room for feminism and queerness, but also for practical, immediate change. The artists who would constitute the first wave of RIOT GRRRL built communitas through personal meetings. It was a discussion of deep, unspoken trauma, of issues of rape, incest, domestic abuse, sexual harassment, housing, job, and academic discrimination. Geography did not limit the spread, as with punk, to urban areas without capitalist commercialization commodifying the aesthetics of the subculture as a marketable demographic. The media attention allowed the sudden spread via fallacy, but also the insurmountable scrutiny that seeks to restore the status quo. RIOT GRRRL presented a set of factors that were easily exploited by both parties within the movement and those of the heterodominant patriarchy. Infighting and gossip were unfortunately both toxic and rampant. To compound the issue, by and large, RIOT GRRRL consisted of conventionally attractive, white, college-educated young women. Taking a page from Jones and LaBruce, Kathleen Hanna lied, the fallacy, and stated that RIOT GRRRL was a national movement. It was a revolution, girl style, now. She rattled off a list of cities and active chapters of RIOT GRRRL meetings supporting young women. And when these young women couldn't find said meetings, they simply held their own. And like magic, RIOT GRRRL spread via the principle of subcultural mitosis. Girls to the front, literally asking all of the girls in the club to crowd the stage and the men to the back. It doesn't seem like the most revolutionary confrontational notion, but in the crowded, increasingly violent punk club, it was cannon fired across the bow of male dominance. It seems that within the patriarchal culture, the only physical intimacy allowed to heterosexual identified males in society is through violence, and in this case, moshing and slam dancing. One could spend days extruding the latent homoerotic subtext from a sea of sweaty, shirtless, mostly white, angry young men, violently throwing themselves into each other again and again, the only bodily contact they allow themselves, while their girlfriends, if they have one, are relegated to the back of the club while holding their leather jackets for them. Girls to the front became a rallying cry that was often met with extreme confrontation and the performative victimhood of men who claimed this one minor inconvenience for one show was somehow reverse discrimination. Subcultural mitosis in the internet age moves like light speed. Bronson Purnell states, "The internet has both exacerbated and decimated information. Context is seemingly removed, and as such, subcultures crop up in the unlikeliest places. RIOT GRRRL made its way to Moscow decades after its demise and inspired the political actions and punk rock performativity of Pussy Riot. Where QUEERCORE and RIOT GRRRL both existed in parallel timelines, life cycles roughly from 1990 to 1995, liminality is no longer the obstacle. Due to the commodification of art and ideology and data, everything is available and subject to endless revival with the touch of a button. These scenes do not exist until they do, and fate can be just as real."